Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. My name is Anton, and in today's video, we are going to be ranking every single Game Boy. The Game Boy is absolutely one of my favorite consoles of all time, so let's take a look at each different console and rank them all based on the different features. So a couple things before we start this video. I just want to let you know that we'll only be covering Game Boy systems. That means no Game Boy player, because as much as that plays Game Boy games, it's not a Game Boy, and no DS systems that play Game Boy games. So we're only talking about the real Game Boy hardware. So before we get started, guys, make sure to hit the subscribe button, and let's get ranking. Right, Toad? He's extremely talkative today. Let's get started. The Nintendo Game Boy is definitely one of my favorite systems of all time. Although it might not have the best technology compared to today's standards, it definitely has a good sound chip that is useful for making chiptunes. The system is a collectible item nowadays, with a great library of games to go along with it. The Game Boy is easily recognizable, and it has a very memorable design and, of course, the green screen. However, the screen is possibly the worst part of the Game Boy, as it's not easy to see, especially in the dark when there's not a lot of light. Ghosting is something that occurs a lot when you're playing the Game Boy. And for anyone who doesn't know, ghosting is when the sprites become very blurry when they're moving very fast. This often happens when playing platformers, and it can be very annoying when playing games that require accuracy. The system uses 4 AA batteries, and because of all its components, it's very clunky. Because of this, the Game Boy isn't the best option compared to other Game Boy models, but it is still a great collector's piece, and a great piece of gaming to own if you want to experience the beginning of Nintendo handhelds. 7 years later, after the original Game Boy, Nintendo decided to make the Game Boy more pocket-friendly with the Game Boy Pocket. This Game Boy is thinner and lighter than the Game Boy. It uses 2 AAA batteries because it needs less power, but most importantly, it has a better screen that is black and white. Because the screen looks better, it's very easy to see the games, especially when you have a light. Even the contrast slider works a lot better in this case. Some accessories are easy to use because of the different accessory ports, as the Game Boy does have a different one that works with different accessories. But I'm pretty sure there are adapters that you can change the different ends between the Game Boy and the Game Boy Pocket. Overall, it is a fantastic Game Boy if you want the original look and feel of the original Game Boy without the terrible screen and the clunkiness. So it's definitely a great choice. Now we're jumping to 1998 with the Game Boy Color. This is Nintendo's first handheld that has a color display. At least I think so, and the Game & Watch doesn't count. But not only does it have a color display, it has a better processor that can run more advanced games. The Game Boy Color is honestly a very nice looking system, even comparing it to today's handhelds. The design is really comfortable to hold and easy to take on the go, as it keeps the Game Boy Pocket's small and thin design. The buttons feel really nice on the system, similar to the Game Boy Pockets and Game Boy Light. And the D-pad feels really good too. The Game Boy Color uses 2 AA batteries, but it has a really nice weight to it, which always feels good to have in a quality piece of technology. The Game Boy Color plays all Game Boy games, and it also adds color palettes to them, which you can customize by pressing different color combinations on the startup screen. But on top of that, the Game Boy Color also introduced 2 types of cards that it can play. The first are these black Game Boy cartridges that can be played in both Game Boy and Game Boy Color hardware. These games look great on the Game Boy, but when they're put into a Game Boy Color, they have special added bonuses and sprite differences that make them look a lot better. And the second cart, which is the Game Boy Color exclusive cart, takes full advantage of the Game Boy Color. It can display complex sprites and colors, and even do some different things on top of that. Overall, the Game Boy Color is a great system to play all the classic Game Boy games, but the only thing it really lacks is the backlight. The Game Boy Light is a Japanese exclusive Game Boy, probably why you have not seen it before. It was released in 1998 for a couple of months before the Game Boy Color released. It's a more collectible item that is not easy to find. It is mostly similar to the Game Boy Pocket, but it has some differences in its size and screen. It's only slightly larger than the Game Boy Pocket, and it uses 2 AA batteries instead of how the Pocket used 3 AAA batteries. But the main thing of the Game Boy Light is that it has a backlit display. In daylight, you can't see it as well, but when it gets darker, the backlight definitely comes in handy and looks really good. It has a sort of bluish color to it, which is why I think it looks really cool. What's nice about the Game Boy Light is that the switch on the top allows you to toggle on the light feature. So for example, say you just want to play in regular, like a Game Boy Pocket mode, that will definitely help your battery life. And of course you can switch it on whenever you want. So it's really nice. A couple of years later, after the Game Boy Color released, the Game Boy Advance launched. The Game Boy Advance is a 32-bit system, meaning that it is more powerful than the Super Nintendo. Now games are finally able to look a lot better than the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. But what's really nice about the original Game Boy Advance is it has a really nice, comfortable feel to it. And it's really nice to hold. And it's not vertical like the other Game Boy, so it's probably just because of that as well. Of course, this is probably a really nice Game Boy to use with the Game Boy Player, as it really feels like a nice controller. The Game Boy Advance introduced the L and R buttons on two handhelds, and this is finally the first case of it becoming like a Super Nintendo and a home console. Of course, on the other Game Boy Advance systems there are L and R buttons, but they feel the best here. Of course, all of the same accessories that worked for the Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Color, and also the Game Boy Light, work here as well, but they made a slight modification to the port where Game Boy Advance accessories have a slightly different part in it, so that way they couldn't be used with, of course, older Game Boy hardware. So that's why they did that. But overall, it is a very nice system to hold, and maybe if you're thinking about it, you can also backlight these as well. But of course, there's another alternative for a backlit Game Boy Advance, as we'll see. Around the time of the DS launch, Nintendo wanted to make the smallest Game Boy yet, and they did that with the Game Boy Micro. The Game Boy Micro incorporated many of the best features from the Game Boy Advance SP, including the headphone jack, but it had to eliminate some of them because of the size. And of course, the big one is backwards compatibility of older Game Boy games, meaning that Game Boy Color games and original Game Boy games do not work here. And they don't work because of a special switch that is removed, because of the size. Obviously, they want to remove that special switch that changed it from Game Boy Advance mode to Game Boy Color mode. But with the Game Boy Micro, it definitely has a fantastic screen. And you can also adjust the brightness. There's actually a lot of brightness levels. So the screen is probably the best screen on the Game Boy line of handhelds. But the problem is the size. The size isn't very adult hand friendly. I mean, I don't have the biggest hands in the world, so it definitely helps. But for a lot of people, I can tell that it can be quite annoying to play. Especially since the screen is so small sometimes that your eyes, you don't want to strain them. So, like, to be honest, it's not the best Game Boy to play on, but the hardware is fantastic. Overall, it's a collectible item, and it's not the best recommended Game Boy to play, but it has a lot of great features that make it way better than the others. So, definitely if you see one, maybe think of picking it up because they're definitely fun to play. And finally, coming in at number 1 is the Game Boy Advance SP. Released in 2003, this handheld is the most advanced Game Boy. With its easy-to-pocket clamshell design and portability, it's very easy to take anywhere. There are 2 different types of Game Boy Advance systems, as the main difference between them is the type of screen. The AGS-001 has a frontlit screen that can be toggled on and off. Although it's not preferred, it actually looks pretty decent. The colors do look a little washed, but overall it's still a really good option to play a lot of Game Boy games. The AGS-101 has a backlit screen that can change brightness levels. This is the best Game Boy, and if you do find an AGS-101 model for a pretty good price, definitely think of picking one up. The Game Boy Advance SP has a rechargeable battery that lasts for a very long time. And luckily, you can easily swap them out, so it's not like you have to take the entire system apart. The system plays all Game Boy titles, and of course, has the functionality of the Game Boy Color, and, of course, the Game Boy Advance. Meaning this is the best way to play Game Boy games because they look fantastic. But sometimes, the system can feel a little uncomfortable because of its very square design, and the buttons are very clicky. The Game Boy games do stick out quite a bit when you're putting them in the system, because they don't stick up, they stick down, so it can feel a little awkward as well, and the system does not have a headphone jack. Overall, the Game Boy Advance SP is probably the best Game Boy out there, and if you do, definitely find one for a pretty decent price, because they're pretty pricey, but they're definitely worth it if you do want to play games. Of course, there's also the Game Boy Player, which is also a good option if you do have a GameCube and you really don't want to have the Game Boy hardware. But of course, I didn't include that, like I said in the beginning, because I wanted to rank each and every Game Boy. With, of course, giving you guys an idea of what each one offers, just in case maybe you're looking to buy one. And guys, that brings us to the end of the video. If you did enjoy it, make sure to leave a like, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for future videos on the channel. We have content coming out every week. And of course, don't forget to leave a comment down below letting me know what you guys thought of the list, because you might hate it, you might like it, it might be the worst thing ever. But hopefully you guys did like something in there. But I will see you guys in the next video.